The economic crisis. The financial meltdown of 2008 and the ensuing global economic crisis has been one of the most well-publicized developments of modern history. Having prompted the largest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s, the current economic crisis has been subjected to unprecedented study and analysis. Governments and policymakers across the globe have implemented measures in attempts to revive the economy and put it back on its feet. Some of these have been successful, while others have not. What the majority of these measures have in common, however, are agendas that prioritize the interests of corporations and companies over that of the people. As we have seen in the past, the majority of governments reacted to the crisis by coming to the aid of ailing corporations. Bailouts on the scale of billions of dollars were given to many in a desperate attempt to keep these institutions afloat. Policy and lawmakers seem to have forgotten to address the other important question at hand, though. Who would keep the people afloat in such times? Reformulating the question. The current global economic crisis poses a severe threat to the enjoyment of human rights. It has negatively impacted human rights across the world. It is the world's poor and the marginalized, especially women, children, youth, and minorities, that are particularly vulnerable to the impact of the crisis. They are likely to suffer disproportionately from the increases in poverty, loss of jobs, and access to social safety nets and services. Discrimination and xenophobia towards minorities and migrant workers, who could be accused of stealing jobs or competing unfairly, also risks increasing. It is not only the impact of the crisis that risks negatively impacting human rights, but also the responses of governments to the crisis. Flaws with governmental policy. The human rights implications of the economic crisis are often left unconsidered or shunned to the background behind other considerations. As mentioned earlier, priority is often given to firms and corporations firstly. The government also has its own political considerations to take into account. Human rights often comes last. Thus, the policies put in place by governments and lawmakers to combat these crises often tend to aggravate human rights rather than improve them. The biggest casualties of the crisis are not the corporations or the banks. It is the people, members of the public such as you and me. And yet, governmental responses often fail to reflect this fact. A striking example of such a case is provided by the well-publicized austerity measures put in place by the Greek government to help finance the country's increasingly worsening debt crisis. Background to the Greek debt crisis. In the early mid-2000s, the government took advantage of Greece's strong economy by running a large deficit. As the world economy cooled in the late 2000s, Greece was hit hard. Tourism, one of the country's biggest earners, was on the decline. As can be seen in the diagram, revenues in the industry have fallen steadily in recent years. The country's other major earner, the shipping industry, has also suffered as it was especially sensitive to the changing business cycle. With the country having been in recession for the past 6 years, the GDP figures have fallen quite drastically as shown. As a result of all this, the country's debt began to pile up rapidly. In early 2010, policymakers declared that emergency bailouts would be necessary. The austerity measures being implemented in Greece at the moment represent an attempt by the government to lower its budget deficit and pull the country out of debt. Perhaps even more importantly, though, the austerity measures have been put in place in line with the demands of the EU and the IMF. These two major donors of Greece have been responsible for providing the country with its bailout funds. There is a catch, however. The EU and the IMF have, by and large, made all bailouts to Greece incumbent upon the country's implementation of the austerity measures. The austerity measures in Greece. The austerity measures put in place by the Greek government paint a very bleak picture for its citizens. The measures primarily revolve around the following. Cutting wages. Public sector wages have been cut by a cumulative 20% since 2010, while wages in state-owned enterprises have been cut by 30%. All civil servants have been put on partial pay as well. Pensions, meanwhile, have been cut by 20 to 40%. The retirement age has also been increased to 65. Health and education. The government plans to cut spending on healthcare by 1.8 billion euros between 2012 and 2015. Education spending is also being trimmed down by shutting down schools or merging them. Taxes. Taxes have risen for people in nearly all tax brackets with the lowering of the untaxable threshold income. Sales taxes and VAT have also risen by nearly a third. Privatization. The government also plans to sell its stakes in various banks, utilities, ports, airports, and land holdings to raise money. Many of these will be sold to foreign governments or corporations, further weakening the economy in the future. The human rights consequences of austerity in Greece. The state of human rights in Greece is fast deteriorating as a result of the government's austerity measures. United Nations independent expert Cephas Lumina carried out a mission to Greece in April to assess the situation there. He claimed that the bailout conditions imposed by Greece's international lenders had severely compromised the prospects of an adequate standard of living for many Grecians. A summary of his findings revealed the following facts. 28% of the country's population is currently unemployed, with the figure expected to rise in the coming months as a result of further job cuts. More than 10% of the population in Greece now lives in extreme poverty, and unemployment amongst youth has reached an unprecedented rate of 59.3%. Greece remains the only country in the Eurozone where a comprehensive social assistance scheme serving as a social safety net of last resort is missing. Nearly one-third of the Greek population is without health insurance. This is mainly due to prolonged unemployment. The worrying fact for most is that with further cuts in spending and social programs on the horizon, the situation is likely to get a lot worse before it gets better. The reaction of the people. The people in Greece have not taken kindly to the austerity measures being imposed upon them. And looking upon the figures presented earlier, it is not hard to understand why this is the case. The country has been shaken by an incessant stream of strikes and protests ever since 2010, when the first of the austerity measures were voted in favor of by the Hellenic Parliament. The protests are usually centered at the country's landmark sites. For instance, the picture below depicts one of the largest sit-ins outside the Parliament building in Athens during one of the austerity voting debates. Although these strikes and protests usually start off as benign, peaceful demonstrations, they often culminate in violence and destruction. As shown in the following pictures, these protests and strikes often spill over into clashes between the people and the police. This represents another factor contributing to the human rights violations in Greece, with large numbers of people having been injured or assaulted by the riot police during such demonstrations. Countless numbers have also been indiscriminately thrown in jail. Even a few deaths have been reported. Racism and xenophobia. Another aspect of the human rights violations in Greece have been the increase in racism and racial attacks in the country. The onset of this increase coincided with the implementation of the austerity measures, with some of the Greek nationals blaming the immigrants for the current state of the economy. As the graph shows, the Racist Violence Recording Network reported 154 cases of racist violence in 2012, including 25 in which the victims said the perpetrators were police. The actual figures are likely to be much higher given the fact that many instances of racist violence are not reported due to fear of further abuse from the authorities and deportation. The economic crisis and the austerity measures, which have plunged the majority of the Greek population into poverty and fueled desperation among them, lie at the heart of many of these attacks. It is the norm for perpetrators of such crimes to go unprosecuted. The government does not appear to be helping matters either. In addition to worsening affairs through the austerity measures, it has also been very hesitant in reforming the country's legal structure and implementing stricter anti-racism laws. The picture below depicts hordes of immigrants in Athens clamoring for fairer and stricter anti-racism laws. Their clamors have fallen upon deaf ears. Another worrying fact has been the increase in the popularity of the far-right, xenophobic Golden Dawn political party that promises to crack down on all foreigners in Greece. Attacks by the group on immigrants, such as the one depicted in this picture below, are not uncommon in Greece now. Thus, the state of immigrants in Greece, both legal and illegal, has been worsening in recent years. In addition to the economic strain put upon them by the austerity measures, they must also now live with the likelihood of racial abuse. Flaws of the governmental response in Greece. As argued in the prior sections of this presentation, the policies implemented by the Greek government in response to the economic crisis have worsened the state of affairs from a human rights perspective. Looking at austerity through a human rights lens, it becomes painfully apparent that there are aspects of it that are completely incompatible with international human rights laws and standards. There are human rights obligations such as non-discrimination and the guarantee of a minimum level of particular rights, for instance, housing, food, and social security, that every government must heed. The austerity measures in Greece are effectively serving to rob the Greek people of these rights. Governments also have an obligation under international human rights law to prevent retrogressive steps backwards in the enjoyment of rights. Austerity, as it stands, serves to do just that. With the lowering of the standard of living and increased unemployment resulting from the austerity measures, hundreds of thousands have been pushed below the poverty line. The response of the Greek government to the surge in racial attacks has also been distinctly discriminatory in favor of the actual perpetrators of the crime, jeopardizing the rights of the already ill-fated immigrants and the minorities. Human rights-centric policy responses. Having seen the flaws of the Greek government's response to the economic crisis, we must then ask ourselves what should rather be done to uphold and protect people's human rights. The answer then must be for governments to adopt human rights-centric policy responses to any scenario. Such responses will aim to focus all implemented policies on rights bearers first and foremost to ensure that they are not made worse off. The policies will be human-centric and dignity-centric, and will focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized sections of society rather than prioritizing institutions and the elite, which is what we tend to see most often in terms of the general response from governments and lawmakers. To return to the case of Greece, then, the government must stop prioritizing membership in the EU over the welfare of its citizens and look to stimulate the economy rather than deflate it as per the EU's demands.